Please welcome Cass Sunstein, founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. He is one of the leading legal scholars in the US and has served as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He is currently the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books. Cass Sunstein, everyone, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be able to talk to you all. On this occasion, the world is very focused on behavioral science and behavioral economics these days. And I'm going to go after the issue by taking a fundamental issue under my wings and asking you to think with me about it. I think I'll go after the issue, which is really what information would you like to have? You might think about COVID-19, you might think about your own economic or health circumstances. I'd like to go after it through a little data, and then I'll tell you some stories, and then we'll get as serious as we can. So here's some data. I asked a lot of people, a nationally representative group, whether they'd like to know whether the person for whom they have romantic feelings reciprocates those feelings. And the answer I got was 58% wanted to know. 42% did not. I was surprised by that answer. I thought that most people would want to know if the person for whom they had romantic feelings reciprocated, but a lot of people didn't want to know. Then I asked a bunch of young people, a small group, about 40 people in college at university, whether they wanted to know whether the person for whom they had romantic feelings reciprocated. And almost all of them said yes. It was almost unanimous. That's a clue about the complexity of whether people want information or not. Now, the stories. When I was in the White House, we had a debate about calorie labels. This is a policy issue. It also connects with human health and connects with deep questions about what people want to know and what people don't want to know. I was of the view that we should extend our calorie label requirement to movie theaters. And eventually that view prevailed. The government said, if you go to the movie theater, you're going to see the calories of your options. I sent a notation on the day of the White House announcement by email to a very good friend that this policy had gone in the direction I had argued for. And her answer to me had 3 words. They were, Cass ruined popcorn. That wasn't a very encouraging note, but it was a very instructive note. What she was saying was, when you go to a movie to see the new Star Wars film or something from Paris or something from Bollywood, what you probably don't want to do as the lights go down and you're eating is to be thinking, what you don't want to do is to be thinking, I'm getting fat. That's important. The second story is personal, with your indulgence. Several decades ago, my father, then relatively young, in his 60s, started to stumble on the tennis court. He was a very good tennis player and he didn't usually stumble. My mother and I took him to the hospital for a series of tests. And after about 5 hours of tests, my dad and I were eating a meal in the hospital. And my mother came up to say, we have some very good news. There's nothing seriously wrong. You're basically fine. She told her husband, you'll be able to go home tomorrow and we don't need to worry about anything. We had our meal, the 3 of us, in the hospital, and it was one of the best meals I've ever had. It was really a meal of relief and celebration. After that, my mother took me down to the parking lot to drive me back to law school, and her face changed. It was as if she was a great actress who had an ability to change her emotion like that. And I saw on her face something I've never seen on a human being since, and it was despair. her face turned to ice, and she said, "Your father has a fatal brain tumor. He's going to die within a year. There's nothing that can be done, and I'm not going to tell him his condition, and neither are you." What she was basically saying was, he has a year to live. It would be too much information, in her opinion, to tell him at this stage that he was as sick as he was. She wanted his last year to have hope and optimism in it. She wanted for as many months as possible for her husband not to see a tombstone every time he went about his day. I think she was also thinking that she herself wanted to be able to enjoy as many of those months as she could. And if both of them were acting as if he was going to be fine, that would be an act of mercy and a kind of blessing. I'm not sure whether my mother was right. I tend to think she was. Different families are different on this. But she was basically saying, in a much more serious context, I don't want to ruin popcorn. Okay, now let's turn to public policy and what governments do and what banks do and what car companies do. There is a pervasive question whether to provide information, warnings, disclosure, details about risks. And it is very important to assess, I suggest, the human consequences of the disclosure. One of the things we want to consider is whether people's emotions are adversely affected. Are they saddened or are they scared? Those aren't the only questions, but they are relevant. When I was in the White House, we focused on the health consequences and the safety consequences of disclosure. And what I want to try to do today is to get clearer than at least I was about the consequences of disclosure. So the first question is, when is information too much information? And when is disclosure a curse? And when is it a blessing? The second question I want to say something about is the category of sludge. And I want to put that on the general view screen for all of us. That if you've tried to get a license or a permit or resources to which you're entitled, maybe from your school, you might have to incur paperwork or administrative burdens. You might have to have a waiting time. If you want a student visa to study in the United States, there's a lot of sludge. I'm going to give you one number, and the number is 11 billion, and that's the number of hours in paperwork that the United States government requires of the American people. 11 billion hours. I have to say that when I was in the White House, I was in charge of a law called the Paperwork Reduction Act. And while we worked at times quite hard to cut those billions of hours, there's much more to be done to reduce sludge. Private and public institutions are requiring too much information. So I'm going to address first the question, what sort of information people should be given? Second, the question, what sort of information private and public institutions are obtaining? That's sludge, and there's much too much of it. And I'm going to say something at the end about use of social media with some recent data which tell us a lot about the answer to the two questions. Okay, for the past few years, I've been engaged in a research project trying to figure out what information people want to have. And I now have data from about 11 nations, and I'm going to give you a glimpse of what humanity wants to know, emphasizing what surprised me, which is that people in different countries, at least the ones we've looked at, and they're diverse countries, are pretty much the same. Not identical, but what human beings answer to the question, do you want to know this? Do you want to know that? Doesn't differ radically across countries. So we're learning something about national differences, but we're also learning something about the human animal. Okay, in one study of one country, and this is pretty representative, I found that 43% of people want to know the calories associated with their meals. A majority doesn't want to know. That's important. It suggests that my friend who was concerned about ruining popcorn was on to something true. Most people don't want to know. About 27% of people want to know the year of their death. And this is roughly what we're finding all over the world, that the strong majority of people think, I don't want to know when I'm going to die. About half of people want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. In some places a little more, in some places a little less. A strong number doesn't want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. About 42% of people, a minority, want to know what their friends and family really think about them. Most people don't want to know. For cancer, a majority wants to know, about 58%. But a lot of people don't want to know. With respect to consumer information, you get somewhere between 50% and 68% wanting to know. 67% wants to know the safety ratings for their tires. A strong majority, around 65%, wants to know what companies are doing with their data, if they're doing something for commercial purposes. About 65% want to know the side effects of pain relievers. So what we're seeing is small majority, significant majority, not overwhelming majority. If you ask how much people want to know, how intensely people want to know, not that intensely. They're willing to pay something for this information, not a whole lot. Okay, for a long time I had this data suggesting a lot of diversity with respect to what people want to know and suggesting there's a lot that people don't want to know. I was just puzzled, what am I learning about humanity? And I'm now going to give you a little framework that is designed to capture what I think the data shows. Okay, when people think about whether they want to obtain or avoid information, they're thinking about just two things. And they're thinking pretty well about those two things. First, they're thinking, is it useful? Is it something that I can do something with that can make my life better? Or is it something that has no value for me at all? Or is it something that is affirmatively harmful in the sense that it will be the opposite of useful? When people say they want calorie labels, they're thinking, and we have other data supporting this, what I'm about to say, they're thinking, I have self-control and I can use that information to manage my weight. And the 43% are people who think this is valuable information. Other people are thinking, I either don't have a weight issue or I have a weight issue and I don't really care. So this is a useless information for me. And in some contexts, people don't want information because they think it will harm their ability to manage their life. If you're a lawyer and you learn that your client is guilty, you might not be as good a lawyer. If you're an employer and you want to hire men and women equally, you might think if certain people know whether a job candidate is male or female, they might discriminate against women. And therefore, blinding yourself to the gender of the applicant, not knowing, might be useful. This is just a suggestion that people have an intuitive sense of whether information is useful, useless, or positively harmful. And that's the first factor. The second factor is more intriguing, and it's that people are acutely attuned to how information makes them feel. When 58% of people say they want to know whether the person for whom they have romantic feelings has romantic feelings back, it's because they're optimistic and they think they're probably going to get good news. When 42% of people say they don't want to know, they're thinking she probably doesn't, or they're thinking if she does, I'm kind of married and I don't want to know, it's dangerous. Or they might be thinking life is just complicated enough already and this is not something that I care to know the answer to. In circumstances in which the economy is doing really well, people are more likely to check their stock market portfolios than when the stock market is doing badly. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you be more likely to check in good circumstances than in bad? It might be more prudent to check in bad circumstances. But people are attuned to the fact that if the stock market is going down, they're going to be sad or scared, and they don't want to see that. When people are uninterested in knowing whether they're going to get Alzheimer's or cancer, it's not because it's useless information necessarily. It's because it's information that would produce a harm to their own well-being, their emotional well-being. And so the theory is that in deciding whether to seek or avoid information, and this is highly relevant to policy, people are making a judgment about the usefulness of the information and the emotional impact of the information, and basically weighting these two variables. If it has a tremendous usefulness but modest emotional impact, people are going to want to get it. If it has modest usefulness and a very negative emotional impact, people aren't going to want to get it. And that's how we explain information seeking and information avoidance. From the behavioral point of view, it must be added that the account I've just given is too simple. And I'm going to give two reasons why. Reason number one is that human beings focus on today and tomorrow, and next year or next decade. Those are foreign countries, later land, and they're not sure they're ever going to visit. If people focus on the short term, they may not want information that is very useful to them over the course of their lives. And the reason they don't want it is the fact that it will benefit their future self doesn't much move them, and the fact that it will make their current self scared or sad does. If people are present biased, as it's called, people will be insufficiently interested in information, even though it could help them and possibly save their lives. This is highly relevant to policymakers who have a clue now about why people avoid information, and also a signal that you want to provide information, even information that is a little scary, in a way that isn't so dispiriting or terrifying that people will just block their ears. Okay, that's present bias. Another factor is that the human animal, and this is probably mostly a good thing, is optimistic by nature. If you're optimistic by nature, then you think things are going to turn out fine, and that may lead you not to seek information, even though it's very much in your interest to get it. If the issue involves health, and think now of COVID-19 and vaccination or social distancing, unrealistically optimistic people might not engage in social distancing, might not get vaccinated, might not wear a mask, not because they are bad people, but because they're human and they think things are going to turn out pretty well for them. If you are unrealistically optimistic, you might not seek information out, thinking things are going to be great, even though the information might tell you something important that could help your economic situation or help you live longer. If we put present bias together with unrealistic optimism, we can see two reasons why human beings will avoid information and ignore information in circumstances in which they really ought to be seeking it out and paying attention to it. This is a policy challenge. It's relevant to banks, it's relevant to hospitals, it's certainly relevant to educational institutions, which might provide information in circumstances in which people might not be especially excited about getting it because it's important for them to receive. By the way, we have a clue here, I think, about some of what we're observing in various parts of the world with respect to climate change, where some people are dismissing the concern and not seeking out information, partly because they're present biased. They think the worst is in the future and who knows what that's going to be, or because they are unrealistically optimistic and they think things are going to turn out fine, even though they might not. Okay, let me say a few words about public policy, and then we're going to turn to sludge and then social media. All over the world, governments are thinking, what sort of information should they require? Should they require a warning? For medicine, should they have a list of side effects? For mortgages and credit cards, should people be given disclosures of various sorts? In some countries, the information disclosures are so lengthy and so complicated and so frightening that they are effectively useless and maybe even worse than useless. If you have information that's so lengthy and complicated and written by my brothers and sisters in the legal profession, then the recipients of information will get no use out of them because they're too complicated, and they might be just scared by them. So information provision needs to be designed in a way that's focused like a laser on how to make it as useful as possible, which typically means simple and clear and straightforward, and also how to make it in general not as scary or off-putting as it might otherwise be. Now, I use the words in general because for some things, fear is a good motivator, and to make people scared of, let's say, swimming under very dangerous conditions, that's a good idea, but you want to do it in a way where the usefulness is sufficiently great that the fact that it makes people scared is outweighed by the fact that their lives are going to be saved. We need to be asking, what are the benefits of information provision and what are the costs of information provision? For some kinds of disclosures, it's really expensive for the bank or the hospital, and it's not doing anyone any good. For other information, it's designed in a way that means the benefits are much lower than they otherwise would be. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about sludge. Every nation in the world, I suggest, and this is an ambitious claim offered with humility, every nation in the world should be doing a sludge audit. By a sludge audit, I mean an audit of the paperwork and administrative burdens it is imposing on its own people. So far as I'm aware, no nation in the world has done a systematic sludge audit, though some nations have done pieces of it. That 11 billion hour figure I gave you is a piece of a sludge audit. It's a component of a sludge audit. Okay, the reason sludge audits are so important, and I think my university, Harvard, should be doing a sludge audit. We're imposing too much sludge on administrators and students and faculty. Not the most serious problem facing the world today, but less would be better. The basic suggestion is that sludge often has a devastating effect on human beings. The reason first is if you are poor or busy or disabled or old or impaired in some way, the fact that you have to navigate some paperwork requirement or administrative burden to get something to which you have a right may be devastating. It might mean you give up. That's just assuming people are rationally balancing labor against potential benefit. If human beings suffer from some sort of, impairment, then the effect of sludge may be especially severe. In one account, which is a little bit funny as well as a little bit sad, there was someone in his 80s describing what he had to do to get benefits to which he had a legal right. And he said, gosh, I'm over 80. I could have done this 20 years ago. Now you're asking me to fill out all these forms? That's just one person, but there are extremely beneficial programs all over the world where the take-up rate ranges from 40% to 80%. Simplification or automaticity in the form of sludge reduction could increase the take-up rate to 100%. And that's just a number, but if we're speaking of people who suffer from serious health conditions, who have a right to medical help that they're not able to enjoy, or single mothers who are taking care of 3 children who have a right to economic help that they're not able to get because they can't navigate the form, then we're talking about sludge reduction as a kind of human rights policy, which can ensure some sort of protection of guarantees which are literally in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, sludge audits and sludge reduction are, I suggest, an important vehicle to give human beings the one thing that we are most blessed to have. And here's what it is, I suggest: time. I promised to say something about social media, and it's going to connect the two themes. There's data on use of social media that suggests the following. If you ask people how much they would demand to give up use of Facebook, say, for the next month, there'll be varying numbers. A certain percentage of people will say, and I found this in my own work as well as other researchers have found it in their work, a certain number of people will say about 100 euros. That's what I demand to give up use of Facebook for a month. Okay, in one experiment, the people who said they demand approximately 100 euros were given 100 euros. This was an expensive experiment, but a lot of people were told, okay, here's 100 euros, you can't use Facebook for the next month. And this was monitored so that they really didn't. What happened was, in the next month, along every measure of well-being, people who were off the social media platform had a better month. They were happier with their lives. They were more satisfied with their lives. Happiness and life satisfaction are not the same, but they were better off on both counts. They were less depressed and they were less anxious. So receiving less information via a social media platform produced an increase in people's life experience. Their well-being increased. Then they were asked after the month, okay, how much would you have to be paid to be off the platform for another month? And the average answer was, I'm pausing for drama, about 87 euros, 13% lower. That's interesting. People learned that being off for a month was better than they thought, so they demanded less. And yet still they demanded real money to be made sadder, more depressed, and more anxious. Why? We don't know, but I think I have a speculation, which is connected with the theme of these remarks. The people who demanded 87 euro were thinking, I understand. Use of the social media platform makes me a little sadder, a little more depressed, a little more anxious. I get that. Still, receiving information is useful. It might be about politics. It might be about the world. It might be about my friends and family. It might not make me so happy to see a picture of my old friend's 1-year-old daughter. Or I might have seen enough pictures of puppies. But I'm also seeing a lot of things that enrich my life and that are useful for that reason, even if they don't make me happier. And that's my main plea with respect to too much information. Okay, I'm going to summarize now and then give you a little literature and then take questions. First, information is often valuable because it's useful and because it makes us happy. It's often a negative because it's not useful and it makes us sad. In deciding whether information is too much or what to seek out in our lives or what to provide as information providers, we should be thinking in a very careful way about usefulness and emotional impact. And that applies to regulators as well as others. We need a war on sludge, commencing with a sludge audit. The good news is that in the last months, there's been a little bit of a set of battles against sludge. Often they've been skirmishes in which private and public institutions have thought, you know what, amidst COVID-19, we're going to take away the administrative burdens. People don't have to come in for an interview. They don't have to fill out a 12-page form. A one-page form is okay. They can use a phone call or a website instead of coming in. We're going to reduce the sludge. We need much more of that, and not just under conditions of a pandemic. With respect to social media usage, cutting it back about 10% is probably a good idea. And thinking with respect to it or any other information provider, what are we getting in terms of our knowledge of the world? How useful is it? And how's it making us feel is a recipe for doing a bit better with respect to information consumption. Okay, I promised or threatened you some literature, and this is going to be very quick. There's a poem, you're going to recognize the last lines, by Thomas Gray, who was speaking of young people whom he was observing with their optimism and hope. And he was saying, writing from the standpoint of an older guy, I guess, that life is going to get hard. And the poem is unbearably moving, unbearably in the best sense. The last words you're going to hear may be familiar, they're cliches. And here's the last lines. After seeing all of them and contemplating the complexity of life, he writes, to each his sufferings, all are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, why should they know their fate, since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies? Thought would destroy their paradise. No more. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That's one side of the coin. That poem is about ignorance as bliss. But there's another side of the coin, which is called knowledge is power. And to capture that, I'm going to quote for you from what I believe is the greatest novel in the English language. Don't argue. The book is called Possession by A.S. Byatt. And this is from a poet, not a real one, a fictional poet, writing to his beloved. And he's writing about reading, but he's also writing about life. And this is a happier account of what it means to be a human being, and signal knowledge is power. I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done with what I need never have embarked on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable?
Thank you, Professor Cass. What a fantastic session. I've been getting messages from all over the world, from people. We have questions. We do have questions, but before I take up those questions, I do want to say thank you for touching about this whole staying off social media. Personally, it touches me a bit because I took, around 4 months off social media, right from middle of March, when there was an overload of pandemic news. And I found myself checking the news every hour to figure out the latest statistics out there. I started getting into WhatsApp debates with friends. And I have a rule of no crap, CRAP, no criticisms, no religion, no advice, no politics when I'm discussing on social media. Before I knew it, I was getting into flame wars with my friends. And so I went off. So it kind of makes me happy to realize there are studies around it. You spoke about it. Thank you so much. There are many questions that I want to touch on the topic itself, too much information, given the fact that, like someone wise said, we have got Paleolithic brains and medieval institutions and godlike technologies, which means we have access to an insane amount of information already. And the brain is not equipped for that. the brain is actually directing the image of the nose all the time, even though we're seeing it. So the brain, like, I don't want this, right? And then there are limits on how many people we can know. Like, I think 150 or so, that much number. So given all of those, there are so many questions you could ask, but it would not be fair to our audience out here. So without further delay, here is the first question from Anand Prahlad. Anand is curious about how could we reduce group polarization leading to extreme opinions and lack of understanding between social groups in society. How do we reduce that polarization?
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So group polarization occurs when people who agree with each other are engaged in discussion with each other. They typically end up in a more extreme position in line with how they thought before they started to talk. And there's data suggesting if you have people of a certain political view, let's say they're somewhat to the right, if they talk to each other, they'll end up more to the right. And exactly the same happens with people to the left. And if you think of how extremism emerges, and it could be violent or nonviolent, it's often like-minded people are talking to each other and they're learning from each other, and what they're learning is supporting their original view, and then they go whoosh to the left or to the right. Okay, a remedy is for us to seek in our individual lives or to create institutions where people are encountering people who are different from themselves and from whom they can learn and whom they can like, who think differently. So you can stop group polarization if people are learning not just from people like them, but people who are different from them. And it works in individual lives. It's working in countries all over the world, not in every country, but where people are learning from each other, and they might not agree, but they might learn, I was wrong at least on this a little bit.
I think the challenge, I guess, would be the act of making people talk with each other, speak with each other. How do you get to do that? Because more often than not, we care so much about our opinions and our beliefs, we would easily ignore the truth. And you know that you've spoken so many times about it. Is there a way we can get these people with, diverse set of opinions to talk to each other? Or like, where do we start? Is it the diverse people who talk, or people who are more at the center, going left and going out? What would be easy?
Okay, here's a thought. This is a deep and large question. Suppose what people have is a task. And the task is, let's say, I'm just going to make up some examples, to build a road, to cure a patient, to solve a national problem, which might involve the pandemic, or it might involve road safety, or it might involve agriculture. If people are focused on a task, then their political disagreements often become like background noise, like eye color, because they may not, but if you're lucky, if you're trying to reduce deaths on the highway, you're not thinking, what are the political convictions of the person with whom I'm working? You're thinking, how do we do it? So task orientation can often, reduce the effects of politics. I saw this, so I worked in Washington under President Obama, and within the Obama administration, there was a diversity of view. And within Washington, of course, there was extreme diversity of view and a lot of polarization. But if there's a task, this is in relatively recent past, if there's a task, what do we do about air pollution? Then people with different political views will have different judgments, but they'll be listening to each other. If people are getting sick because of air pollution, then if we think, what do we do about it? We don't think, what's your political party? We think, what's your proposal? And so to orient on tasks is often, and then people can bond and become friends along lines that have not, it's random, I think, often to think that person has a political conviction. You may have noticed I've lost some hair. I'm completely able to be friends with people who have plenty of hair. And You know, and it would be ridiculous for people who have hair loss to think we should only agree with or work with people who have hair loss. I'm not wearing a tie right now. Should we think that people who are wearing ties can't be trusted? That would be pretty ridiculous.
Well, thank you, Bob. I believe, well, okay, let me not say anything out there. I should not dare speak in your presence. Mm-hmm. Let me come back with another question out here. This question is from Nandita Sengupta, and it is kind of tied down to the same previous theme. She says present bias plus unrealistic optimism. It equates to people who want to avoid and ignore information. But that is the most critical situation actually to create avenues for information to reach them. That situation, right? So have there been case studies where it was possible to inform and achieve some impact in situations like this where people really need the information? Let's say vaccination. And I don't know where you stand on that debate, but most of the people say it's important for them to open up their mind and receive the information that this is really good for their kids, but they are refusing to let the information come in. Right? Have there been ways to reach out to groups like that?
Okay, so this is a great question. So for present bias, you can overcome it in some circumstances by giving people clarity that the life they save may be their own. So you can do it just through words, saying this is you who's at risk, or through pictures this is a little funny experiment where people are shown pictures of themselves 20 years from now, and then they end up showing less present bias because the future self is them. Optimistic bias can be addressed through graphic warnings. So graphic health warnings for smokers give people, they're not actually providing information, they're just graphic warnings, but they do overcome optimistic bias. So there are ways through words or images of reducing the effect of present bias and unrealistic optimism. We've seen all over the world, this is in real time, that not enough, but many people are engaging in precautions with respect to COVID-19. And optimistic bias has been overcome all over the world through credible warnings. I think the other thing to say is that's in several of the questions, the source of the information is very important. So if you hear from someone who you think is an alarmist or a political person, you should be scared. You might think they're just trying to frighten me or increase their own political power. But if there's someone who's known to have expertise or who is of the same identity as you, it might be someone who has lives in the same area, who has the same religion or ethnicity, or someone whom you can't easily dismiss. That can be very helpful. I'll tell you a word in the White House that I learned there. It took me a while to get it. It was almost like a foreign language. The word was validator. It sounds like a villain in a superhero movie. Was Arnold Schwarzenegger a validator? No, Terminator. A validator is someone who validates a proposition. Now, a validator for a government would be someone outside government who says what the government is saying is true. And that makes credible something that might otherwise not be. Now, the secret I learned is to get a surprising validator. So if you got someone who validates a fear about something that people aren't scared of, who is surprising, you wouldn't expect that person to be the validator. That's a very effective validator. So if you want to get young people not to use, let's say, drugs, who are using drugs, if you get someone to say, I was just like you and I was doing the drugs and it was terrible, don't be like me. That's a kind of surprising validator, and it's a convert. Those people can be effective.
Thank you so much, Professor Cass. We are running out of time. There are a good number of questions still. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we will have to kind of cut short here. Apologies for that to all the people all around the world. And thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us. Always lovely to listen to you. We'll catch up with you again at the Behavioral Science Club, I think around November, and then we shall talk about your books out there. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone who is here. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's an inspiration as well as an honor to hear you and the questions, and the world's going to get better because of what you're all doing.
Thank you.